All right. So welcome everybody. Again, I'm Sandra Serini Elzer. I am the Vice President of Advocacy for the League of Women Voters of Michigan, and I'm here with Douglas Jester, who's a wonderful presenter. He's the managing partner of Five Lakes Energy. Douglas specializes in economic analysis and modeling for energy policy. Prior to joining Five Lakes Energy, Douglas served as a senior energy policy advisor for the Michigan Department of Energy, Labor, and Economic Growth. We're so glad you could be here today to join us for this presentation on renewable energy in the UP and all of Michigan. The Michigan Clean Energy and Jobs Act promises 100% clean energy by 2040 and 60% renewable energy by 2035. So tonight we're going to explore how Michigan can get there and what special challenges there are for Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Douglas is going to spend about 30 minutes talking about how we can get to 60% renewable energy by 2035 and the challenges for Michigan. And then we'll have time for your questions. And my colleague, Vicki Paulson of the League of Women Voters of Washtenaw and member of the Environmental Network, will consolidate the questions and ask Douglas to answer them. And also we'll try to get to the questions that you put in when you registered. So as a reminder, the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization. The League works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, such as the importance of working to alleviate the worst effects of climate change for us and our children and our grandchildren. So with that, I'm pleased to turn the program over to Douglas. Douglas?
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I'm pleased to talk with you tonight. I have 20 slides, which I think I can run through in the planned time, and then we'll undertake to answer any questions that you have until you're tired of it. So, just a couple more words about Five Lakes Energy. I am a co-owner, but we have now a total of 20 staff. We do a lot of work in regulatory proceedings for public utility commissions, particularly in Michigan, but also elsewhere. Have a team focused on industrial decarbonization, a team focused on buildings and transportation decarbonization, and then a lot of our work is centered around the power system. So it's the power system part that is really the focus tonight. And I was involved in the implementation of Michigan's first renewable energy standard, which was adopted in 2008. And then in the revisions that were done in 2016 and 2023, and continue to be involved in the implementation of those, largely through work before the Michigan Public Service Commission. So I want everyone to know that I'm a partisan to some extent, in that I go into these regulatory proceedings and argue for utilities to do differently than they propose to do, that sort of thing. Most of what I'm going to present tonight is not contested, but right at the very end, I'm going to talk a little bit about the RICE engines and other things in the UP, and that is a contested matter. So I just want everybody to, be aware that I have a position and a role in that, but others might have different views. So let's move on. I'm going to speak to renewable energy in the UP and all of Michigan. Michigan law requires that electric utilities meet renewable and clean energy standards, and those apply to the UP utilities, but there are some special issues. Sorry. So Michigan has three distinct types of standards that apply to Michigan utilities, and I want to briefly mention the first, customer energy optimization, just as context, and then mostly concentrate on the renewable energy standard and the clean energy standard. The customer energy optimization encompasses something you might have heard of, which is Michigan's energy waste reduction program or standard. That requires both gas and electric utilities to help their customers save energy. use it more efficiently and more cost effectively. The renewable energy standard, Sandra introduced pretty well, but it requires electric utilities to get an increasing share of the power that they supply from renewable resources. And then the clean energy standard goes beyond that and ultimately requires 100% of what they sell to come from either renewable or other clean energy sources. And I'll give more definition to those a little later. So the energy optimization standard basically directs each utility to offer energy efficiency assistance to their customers, and they provide education, promotion, and financial assistance for that. They also engage in what is called load management, which is basically helping people to shift their use of electricity from times when it is in tight supply to times when it is in greater supply. And that helps utilities avoid the costs of extra power generation for those times when supply is tight. And then beginning in 2023, gas utilities, municipal and cooperative electric utilities can offer electrification measures as a part of their efficiency programs. The rules for that are a little bit abstruse, but the basic idea is that if by electrifying someone can use less energy than they do using a heating fuel, then that is beneficial and can be done through these programs. The structure of these is, first, there are minimum standards each utility must meet. They can opt to just pay a certain amount to a kind of vanilla program that's administered by the Public Service Commission, but the investor-owned utilities have shareholder incentives to have their own programs that outperform those minimum requirements. The minimums are to help their customers, electric utilities have to help their customers save at least 1.5% of annual consumption each year. Just a little definitional clarity here. Let's say they help someone with a more efficient refrigerator, and the refrigerator lasts 15 years. What counts here is just the savings in the first year. And then the rest of the life of the refrigerator is a continuing benefit of that. So the amount that they have to accomplish each year, we refer to as incremental annual savings. For the gas utilities, the minimum standard is 0.85% of annual consumption. The incentives are a graduated system of percentages of either their costs for the programs or the share of the savings that customers get from those programs. It's the lesser of the two. And the greater the savings that they help their customers accomplish, the greater the percentages that they get. So in practice, given those incentives, most of the electric utilities are around 2% per year savings, and the gas utilities are around 1%. That has caused actual consumption of both electricity and natural gas in Michigan to gradually decline ever since these programs took effect in 2010. Not rapidly, but definitely decline rather than to increase. There's a cost effectiveness test that's applied. The utility spending on these programs has to be less than the utility's avoided cost as a result of the savings. So on the electricity side, what they spend on helping customers save electricity needs to be less than it would have cost them to produce that electricity absent the savings. And we refer to that as the utility system resource cost test. That test does not apply to programs that assist income qualified customers. Income qualified customers are those that, as a household, are below 200% of the federal poverty level, or they are recipients of any of the usual income support programs, public assistance programs. And the gas utilities are required to spend at least 35% of their program budget for customer energy optimization on low-income households, and electric utilities at least 25% on low-income households. Michigan is ranked by the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy as the third best state in the country on this kind of programs. So actually something that works very well. Our utilities do it well, given the incentives, and we should be proud of that. Now I want to turn to the real topic today, which is the renewable and clean energy standards. And on the renewable energy standard, I want to talk a little bit about what the requirements are, the definition of renewables, and then a topic that we use for scorekeeping, which is renewable energy credits. So the requirements, beginning with the 2008 law, were that each utility needed to reach 10% renewables by 2015. And then that continued through 2018. We had 2016 legislation that raised it to 12.5% in 2019 and 20, and 15% in 2021. And that has continued since. The 2023 revisions to the law said that beginning in 2030, they needed to be at 50%. And then beginning in 2025, 60%. All of these are as a percent of sales by the utility. So I need to explain a few things, because when we get to the more complicated issues on the Upper Peninsula, these matter. So the first thing to understand is that it used to be that utilities basically produced the power for their own customers. That is no longer true. Now, all of the Michigan utilities belong to what are called regional transmission organizations who operate regional power markets. Most of Michigan, other than the southwest corner of the Lower Peninsula, is in the market administered by the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, which we all commonly call MISO. And under the rules of those markets, they buy 100% of the power that they supply to their customers from the power pool. And then anything they generate, they sell to the power pool. And MISO makes the market by getting data from the utilities every day about how much power they're going to need the next day, as well as offers for what price the utilities or independent power producers would require to produce power with each of their power plants. And then they basically rank order the power plants and decide they take the cheapest ones and decide which ones need to run to meet the required amount of power. There are some other things that they worry about, like contingencies. What if, a transmission line goes out or a power plant fails and so on, and they plan for that as well. But the core idea is that they need to match the power generation in the whole pool to the required load of the whole pool. And they do not pay any attention in doing that to which power plant belongs to which utility and which utility has the demand. They're just aggregating the power supply to serve the aggregated load. So when we say a utility has to meet a renewable energy standard, we're really saying they have to arrange to sell into the power pool a level of renewable energy that is a certain percent of their sales. And there's not an actual delivery of that renewable power to their own customers. So that's the kind of the generation and load balancing that takes place. And that load balancing is done in 5-minute intervals, and they also create a wholesale price of power in those 5-minute intervals. So basically, no power plant runs unless it can operate more cheaply than the price that's being paid for the power it would produce. Another thing to be aware of is that generation exceeds load. It takes electricity to push electricity through the transmission and distribution wires. And on average, about 8% of the electricity that's generated is consumed by that process. And that's not counted as sales. So our renewable and clean energy standards as a percent of sales leave room for some generation that is not renewable or not clean to meet that requirement of electricity for transmission and distribution. That is not a mistake. It was a deliberate thing that we did. And the reason simply is there have been a lot of research projects where people have developed models of the national power system and looked at the costs of achieving various levels of cleanness. And basically, you get up to 90 or 95% of all the power being renewable, and then it starts to get rather expensive with current technology. So what this does is take us right up to what is economical to do, and leaves a little bit to be addressed with future technologies or even continued use of fossil generation. Utility compliance for this is that the utility can own and operate its own generating units that are renewable, like a wind farm or a solar array or a hydropower dam. We'll talk about those a little more. Or they can enter what's called a power purchase agreement, essentially a purchase contract with a third party to take the power that comes from such a resource. And then they automatically turn around and sell it to MISO. The price that they are paying that third party may at any time be greater or less than the MISO price. So by entering a power purchase agreement, they're providing price certainty to whoever develops and owns that renewable generation. And the utility is taking on the risk of the price difference between that and the MISO price. And that is all, the amount of renewables that they bring into the world by one of those means is tracked with what's called a renewable energy credit, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But to facilitate this compliance, we allow renewable energy credits to be sold between utilities. So when utility has excess and other has a shortage, they can sell them and bring the utility that is short into compliance. And that takes a lot of the risk out of meeting these standards for the utilities, because variations in how things go don't trip them up. So renewable resources are defined in Michigan's law. The definition is about 3 pages. I'm not going to take you through it entirely, but just as a brief summary, it's wind, solar, it's hydropower, but we don't allow that to come from new dams. And it's biomass, but there are a variety of types of biomass and restrictions on those, really driven by the need to limit pollution, because most of the biomass generation is burning something, which then has emissions, and that pollution is of concern. The general definition is that renewables are forms of energy that are replenished on a human timescale. So now renewable energy credits, it's how we keep score on all of this. So if someone generates a megawatt hour of electricity from a renewable resource, they earn as well a renewable energy credit. And they submit documentation to the Michigan Public Service Commission, and that credit is granted in a registry that is operated on behalf of the commission. For context, a megawatt hour is 1,000 kilowatt hours. Kilowatt hours are the unit of electricity that you pay for on your bill. Depending on your utility, it's sort of in the 15 to 25 cents a kilowatt hour range for a residential customer. And the average household in Michigan uses about 750 kilowatt hours, or 3/4 of a megawatt hour per month. So just trying to give you a little bit of context. Michigan's total use of electricity in an average year is 105 million megawatt hours, or 105 trillion kilowatt hours. So all of the stuff we do with utilities involves big numbers. So including, unfortunately, the dollars. So each of those renewable energy credits is put into the registry with an identified owner, whoever either owns the resource or has the power purchase agreement from it. And then every year, each utility reports how much electricity they sold over the course of the year, and then the relevant percentage is applied to that to determine how many renewable energy credits must be retired from their account in the registry. So that's how we hold them accountable for meeting the standard. And then, as I mentioned, renewable energy credits can be transferred in the registry from one owner to another, and that's usually done as a result of a bilateral contract sale of renewable energy credits from one party to another, where usually those parties are both electric utilities serving Michigan customers. With those sales, renewable energy credits have prices. Recent years, those prices have been minimal because we have plenty of renewables to meet the standards, and because renewables are relatively inexpensive compared to other forms of power. But in general, we would expect the price of a renewable energy credit, if it's positive, to basically represent the difference between the cost of producing a megawatt hour with a renewable resource compared to the market price of that power. And we sometimes refer to that as the incremental cost of compliance. And in rate making, we take account of that in determining who pays for what. And it's a subject we don't necessarily need to dig into, but if anyone has questions about it, I'd be happy to take it up. So a renewable energy credit price now is about $2 a megawatt hour, which means it's about 0.02 of a cent per kilowatt hour. So it's not very expensive. And that's kind of today's price. I expect that price will temporarily go up as we approach the 2030 increase in the standards, because everybody's scrambling to build enough renewables, but it will rapidly drop once we have enough renewables in place to meet that standard and so on. So that's kind of how this works. The clean energy standard kind of in a way builds off of the renewable energy standard, but it's worth explaining. The clean energy requirements work very similarly. So we have the same regional power markets, and any production from clean energy resource gets sold into the power pool, just like with renewables. We have the same process of generation and load balancing. Um, the same fact that generation exceeds load. The utility compliance is a little bit different. So the clean energy standard is 80% clean from 2035 to 2039 and 100% clean from 2040 and thereafter. The utilities that are self-regulating in Michigan, the municipal and cooperative utilities, have to develop their own plans and get them approved by their own governing boards. So Marquette, Board of Light and Power, in some cities, it's city council. The cooperatives all have member elected boards. And they submit those plans to the Public Service Commission for a critique, but there's not a case. They don't come before the commission and have to get approval from the commission. But they can be sued by a customer or by the Attorney General if they fail to meet the clean energy standard. And then for the regulated utilities, they're going to have to come into a process called integrated resource planning and demonstrate that they have a plan to comply and then ultimately that they are. And the commission has a variety of sanctions in terms of what costs they allow their utility to recover and things like that. So clean energy under our law is generation that does not emit greenhouse gases. So that would include wind, solar, and hydropower from renewables, but biomass is excluded. Nuclear does not directly generate greenhouse gases, so it counts. And then, as a part of the negotiations for the bill, we wound up with gas generation counting, provided that 90% or more of the greenhouse gas emissions that would otherwise come from the plant are captured and permanently sequestered or stored. And that cannot be for the purposes of enhanced oil recovery. So that means that our clean energy standard, even if we're at 100% clean, is not 100% greenhouse gas free, but it's very close. That's the political process. Carbon capture and storage is an existing technology. It's been used for enhanced oil recovery for about 30 years, injecting carbon dioxide in underground. They do it to push oil out, but you can put it in a place that basically should have no leakage because of the rock formation it's in. There is an energy penalty for that. It takes about 20% of the power that's produced to capture, compress, and then inject this carbon dioxide into a geological formation. And it adds about $20 a megawatt hour. Today, a megawatt hour in the wholesale market is about $40, and then there's some other costs that have to be accounted for. So it's a pretty significant penalty in the market to use carbon capture and storage. I'm hopeful that the economics will mean that we don't do any of this or don't do very much of it, but it is allowed under the law. Compliance I talked about a little bit, but just want to touch the point that the plans have to be developed by 2028. So we don't yet know the plans of each of the utilities. The only two utilities that have already submitted their plans and had them approved are Indiana Michigan Electric Power Company, serves the southwest corner of the state, and they have the Cook nuclear plant. So they just sort of automatically met the standard. And then UPCO, which recently had an integrated resource plan approved that shows that they will meet the standard by about 2040 using 100% renewables. They won't be using nuclear or um, gas with carbon capture and storage. And as I explained, clean energy standard doesn't ban fossil generation. So there are three reasons. I mentioned one of them already, that generation to cover transmission and distribution losses can be fossil under the law. The second thing is that a utility can sell more power to the pool than it takes from the pool. That happens all the time. Um, Today, UMERC purchases about 50% of its power supply from the pool and without matching generation. Its affiliated company, WEPCO in Wisconsin, produces about 20% more than it needs for its own customers and sells that into the power pool. So this is a very common, kind of thing to happen. And I think as we get toward 2040, there'll be a fair amount of that as utilities, find their balance. And then lastly, a utility can supply fossil generation in Michigan and supply clean energy from an out-of-state resource. So it has to be in the same power pool, but the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator extends from Manitoba to Louisiana. So there's and from Michigan out to sort of the eastern edge of the Dakotas, Iowa, and Missouri. So there are a lot of places that you could have a wind farm or a solar array or something like that, where the utility is buying that output and selling it into the power pool. So it counts for them as meeting their clean energy standard while they perhaps continue to operate a fossil generation plant in Michigan. That was not necessarily a compromise. It was sort of dealing with the reality of how these markets are structured and the way reliability is achieved. We will need another round of legislation and development of regulatory practices in the 2030s to push us toward a fully clean power system by 2050, which is the ultimate objective here. So let's talk about the UP a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about renewables in the UP and then the costs and reliability issues. So UP utilities will need about 525,000 renewable energy credits from now through 2029. They are already achieving that level of renewables. So that's not an incremental requirement. Round numbers, 130,000 of those are hydropower. Some of it is from biomass. And then we also have some solar and a little bit of wind. They'll need about 1.75 million renewable energy credits annually from 2030 to 2034, and then about 2.1 million renewable energy credits annually from 2035 and thereafter. And renewables are likely the least cost clean energy for the UP. So I do not anticipate that many or any of the UP utilities will choose to use nuclear or build gas with carbon capture and sequestration. I think they'll meet the clean energy standard entirely with renewables. But we'll have to see what their plans are as they develop them. And that means that they're going to meet the 80% clean standard in 2035, they'll need 2.8 million renewable energy credits instead of just 2.1 million. And then from 2040 until the Tilden mine closes, they need about 3.5 million. And then when the Tilden mine closes, that'll drop back down to about 2.2 million. So the Tilden Mines last disclosure report to uh, investment community said that they expect the mine to operate until about 42 to 2045. So one of the things that um, is an issue that we just need to be careful about is we don't want to have utilities invest and build renewables for 3.5 million renewable energy credits a year in 2040 and continue to produce at that level well after Tilden closes, because there's financial risk to their customers of owning a lot more capacity than they will need, in those later years. Notwithstanding that they can sell that power into the market, it just would be smarter to use some temporary sources along the way. So that is an important UP issue, which we really don't face in the Lower Peninsula. We don't have users of electricity that have a defined, end of life. Certainly, large industrial facilities close from time to time. We've seen that in the past, but new ones are opening. And so we've not had a large decline in electricity demand, such as has happened with UP mines and will happen with Tilden. So UP planning should target, in my view, the post-Tilden needs. And the Tilden renewable energy credits could be purchased from out of state or from the Lower Peninsula. They don't have to be from a local power supply. Hydropower supplies, as I said, about 130,000 megawatt hours or renewable energy credits annually. And then the least cost mixture of wind and solar for the rest is about 50% of power for each. That varies a little bit with the price of electricity versus the price of power and the price of storage. But the fundamental problem is that solar is really good at producing power in the summer and not so good at producing power in the winter. And wind is more or less the opposite. So if you're trying to meet a high renewable energy or clean energy standard throughout the year, you need a dose of wind in the mixture. And they just work out to be about 50% each. If you translate that into what we need in the UP, the UP should host about 530 megawatts of solar generation and about 350 megawatts of wind. Today, we have about 250 megawatts of solar either already built or under construction. And then we have about 30 megawatts of wind, the Garden Peninsula wind project. The land requirements for the additional 280 megawatts of solar and about 320 megawatts of wind are shown here. So the solar occupies the land in the project. And we need a little bit over 2,000 acres of additional solar to meet the UP requirements. Wind has a small footprint, for the turbine and the road to the turbine and that sort of thing. So that amount of wind will only be around 525 acres, a footprint of disturbed land. But they have to be spaced out because the use of wind by one turbine interferes with the use of wind by another turbine that's nearby. That spacing out means that this much wind would be spread over about 50 square miles of the UP. I think despite people's concerns about siting for solar, that is doable. I'm not sure that we're ready to have that much wind in the UP. So that's a concern. In terms of cost of wind and solar continue to decline, and based on current costs, we should be able to meet the standards at less than a half cent per kilowatt hour over business as usual. And I repeat myself. Here we go. Final concern is reliability. We call it resource adequacy in the business. It's a set of requirements that every utility has enough power to meet peak demand of their own customers, contribute that to the power pool. And wind and solar are variable. So you have to make that up with firming resources to match supply and load. That can be continued use of the legacy fossil generation just as an occasional generator. It can be transmission that moves power over an area larger than the weather, so that if you have low production here, you can bring in power from there. Storage, and then flexible demand, the ability to change demand in light of a shortage of supply. Things like, if you have an electric vehicle, you can usually drive it for about a week without charging, so maybe you don't charge it during those days of shortage. Or an industrial plant can temporarily shut down some of its processes, things like that. So UPCO has an approved integrated resource plan. They get to 100% renewables by about 2040 without material costs to their customers over continuing practices. And they get that by using an existing peaker plant, interruptible load, and small amounts of battery storage. UMERC has a case before the commission where they claimed huge expense to comply. That's because they wrongly assumed that they had to close the existing rice plants. That's a reciprocating internal combustion engine using natural gas as a fuel, and would have to add large amounts of storage. And they also planned resources as though Tilden would operate indefinitely. And then their public statements about the cost were all of the costs, not net of the avoided costs of other forms of generation. And this is still active before the Public Service Commission. And I am a party in that case. So this is definitely a point of view not agreed to by UMERC. So that's my rundown. Happy to take questions. Sandra, you're muted.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. So I do want to say that I did not look at the questions that were in the registration because I forgot. And probably you can all put your questions in the chat if you remember them. I will look at them after the presentation. I can't do it now because I'll interrupt this meeting. And then if there are any questions that weren't addressed, I will ask Douglas if he would address them after the meeting and email the answers to me. So I thank you, Douglas, for doing that.
Sure, I will.
Okay, so now I'm going to turn this over to Vicky.
Yeah, we have quite a number of questions here, quite a few of them having to do with the Lansing area. But before we get to that, one of these questions wants a little clarification. Are the years for the renewable energy requirements correct? She's having trouble, that person's having trouble understanding why it's 50% for 2030 through 2024, and then jumps to 60% from 2025.
It's 50% from 2030 to 2034, and then 60% beginning in 2035. So I apologize if I erred on that.
Okay, great. And then someone asked if an individual homeowner can get renewable energy credit if they install a solar array.
Yes, you can. And as a matter of law, you own that renewable energy credit. You can sell it to another party, including a utility, if you want to. Some years ago, we at Five Lakes Energy were asked if we would serve as an aggregator for that purpose, and found it very difficult because utilities don't and this is appropriate, they don't say who has a solar system. I can't go find out and approach somebody. We had to just spread the word. And so the transaction costs turned out to be more than the revenue from selling the renewable energy credits. So as a matter of reality, I think probably not going to happen. At best, it would be beer money, but you could do it.
Okay. And along the line of cost, where is a reliable source to see the cost of various forms of energy generations, to see which is the cheapest and how much one source costs compared to another?
Yeah. I'll refer you to two widely used and well-respected sources. One, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which is a part of the U.S. Department of Energy, annually produces something they call the Annual Technology Baseline, and it includes all the economics of all the different forms of generation. And they have some pretty good visualizations on their website, plus you can download a spreadsheet and really get into it if you want. The other is that an investment bank called Lazard, Lazard, has for, I think, 14 years published an annual paper making those comparisons and showing the trends. And that you can usually find if you just search for Lazard Renewable Energy. And then if you really want to be wonky about it, the utility filings before the Michigan Public Service Commission in their renewable energy plans and what are called reconciliations of those plans show that their actual costs, those aren't much use for projection like Lazard and National Renewable Energy Laboratories technology baseline, but you can see what they were in the past for the kinds of resources that they have. But of course, you can't see anything that they don't have because that cost is not, something that they would report. The utilities, when they do an integrated resource plan, consider the cost of all the options, and they typically use the National Renewable Energy Laboratory Annual Technology Baseline as their source material for those costs, or they go out for bids and then report the costs that they get through their bids.
Now, you mentioned that nuclear power is clean, but not renewable.
Right.
So someone's asked about the status of nuclear power in Michigan. Is there anything being considered to being brought back online that's been decommissioned?
Mm-hmm. So we have 3 operating nuclear plants in Michigan, 2 units of the Cook plant near Bridgman, Southwest Michigan, owned by Indiana, Michigan, and the Fermi plant downriver from Detroit, owned by DTE. And then there's a plant called Palisades, which is also over on the Lake Michigan shoreline, that long ago belonged to Consumers Energy, and then they were going to build the Midland nuclear plant and nearly went bankrupt. As part of that, they sold Palisades and entered a power purchase agreement to take the power from it, from the new owner. Palisades was retired on economic grounds about 4 years ago. And then it is being brought back. It now has an operating permit from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and they are in the process of fueling the plant. If all goes well, they will begin operations late this year. They've contracted that's being done by a company that was in the business of decommissioning nuclear power plants. They have 2 power purchase agreements for the power from that plant. About 60% of it will go to Wolverine, which is a generation and transmission cooperative owned by the Lower Peninsula retail cooperative electric utilities. And then the remainder is going to a similar group of municipal and cooperative utilities in Ohio. So all of that is claimed already. And beyond that, people are making a lot of noise about doing new nuclear, but new nuclear is about 4 times as costly as solar plus storage. So sort of similar reliability. So we'll have to see if anybody can demonstrate that that is the right economic choice for a Michigan utility.
But we do have a number of questions about the Lansing Board of Water and Lights.
Mm-hmm.
So did you make any suggestions to the board in the proposed Lansing City Charter governing the LBWL? And if so, what were they?
So just a little background. We had an ice storm in Michigan a decade or so ago that caused an extended outage. In the aftermath of that, the Lansing Board of Water and Light went through a number of reforms, and one of which was to add, through the Lansing City Charter, non-voting members from the non-Lansing communities that are served by the Lansing Board of Water and Light. And I represented East Lansing as a commissioner on the Board of Water and Light for about 5 years. Ended my term in July of 2023. So I have not given any advice to Lansing Board of Water and Light since then. And before that, I did not make any recommendations about governance. I did make recommendations about their power supply and other matters, some of which they took and some of which they didn't. I did not recommend that they invest as heavily in gas as they are doing, but we shall see how that works out. I hope that answered the question. But.
Well, if a citizen wants to make a meaningful public comment to the Lansing Board of Water and Lights, let's see, about its next IRP, how would they go about doing that?
The Board of Water and Light should hold public meetings to solicit input about their integrated resource plan. That's considered best practices. It's required of the regulated utilities by the Michigan Public Service Commission. And it is something that the Board of Water and Light did their last 2 IRPs. But beyond that, it's a matter of showing up at the Board of Water and Light Commission meeting and using your 3 minutes to say your piece.
One last question about the Lansing area. Do you think that board could build solar over Lansing parking lots? Why or why not?
Yeah, well, they could. Some of you might be aware of the solar over the parking lots at Michigan State University. Those are more expensive than other utility scale solar, largely because the racking to hold them up above the parking lot and allow parking underneath is just more expensive than when it's mounted closer to the ground. But of course, it doesn't require additional land. So that is a valid choice that Board of Water and Light could make, but there would be some price for it.
Mm-hmm. All right. What do you think are the effects of the new federal energy policy on clean and renewable energy?
Yeah, we've been doing work on that. Been helping the Attorney General with responses with a group of attorneys general to the Trump administration on some of these matters. So, with the tax credits that were available as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act, renewables were not only cheaper than other new forms of generation, but they were also cheaper than most existing generation. With the loss of the tax credits through HR 1, I refuse to call it that other name, the renewables are still cheaper than other new forms of generation, though the margin is, closer. And I think they're still cheaper than continuing to operate existing coal plants, but it's not always the case anymore that they're cheaper than continuing to operate an existing gas plant. So what I think we will see is there's a lot of upset in the marketplace right now, but renewables are still winning bids, and where they are sort of all source bids, and we will continue to see renewables as the choice for new generation. We just may see utilities drag out longer before retiring some of the fossil plants. The other thing worrying me is that they're doing a lot to disrupt permitting processes, and where the federal government is involved, particularly for wind. And it just may be really hard to get wind done, and take longer to do. It's things like reviewing whether a particular proposed wind farm will interfere with air traffic, which is something that has to be checked. And if the federal government doesn't sort of process that request, then you can't build your wind farm. So.
And can you comment on legislation that would allow RICE generators to be considered clean energy in the UP?
Well, first of all, it's kind of Orwellian to call it that. It's not clean. There are other ways that they could have proposed to make an exception and just say these utilities, are exempted to some degree without trying to pretend that they're clean or renewable. But I also think that they're trying to solve the wrong problem. I've been careful through this presentation to say that you don't have to shut down all fossil generation in order to meet the renewable and clean energy standards. You can continue to use the existing fossil plants, including those RICE engines. They can be used to the end of their natural lives. The real problem for UMERC is that something like 2/3 of its load, of its sales, is to the Tilden mine, which is at some point going to stop needing all that power. And at that point, if they built up their renewable portfolio to meet renewable and clean energy standards on a long-term basis, including the Tilden mine, then they would have a problem on their hands right after that. So that is in fact what a lot of the argument in their current case is about. And I think there are ways, to mitigate that problem. But I do agree that if they just did the simple things as expected in the law, that could be challenging. So we need to find a different path for them to comply on it, for a period of about a decade.
Right. What's your opinion of Senate Bills 395-56? So it's what's listed here, which would have the state assume potential environmental liability for CCS?
Mhm. So I have reasons to favor and reasons to oppose. I have been trying to make
Can you
them
explain what that bill is, Douglas, first?
sure. I've been trying to improve on it, so pretty familiar with it. Basically, um, if somebody wants to do carbon capture and sequestration, they're going to attach something to essentially the smokestack of a power plant or a cement plant or something like that. They're going to get the carbon dioxide that's coming from it, compress that into a pipeline. That pipeline goes out somewhere geologically favorable, and then there's an injection well that injects that carbon dioxide underground. It has to be at least 3,500 feet deep in order to have enough pressure that the carbon dioxide will be in a kind of liquid form rather than a gas. And more likely it'll be, 8 or 10,000 feet below ground. It'll go into a porous rock formation that has a hard rock cap that should not leak. And it'll spread out through that porous rock formation. At the scale of a gas power plant operated for 20 years, the area in which that carbon dioxide would spread under the ground, way down deep, is going to be tens of square miles. Depends exactly where in Michigan you do it. Could be hundreds of square miles. So it obviously goes under the property of lots of surface owners. So what this bill does is to set up something called unitization, where a majority of the surface owners can agree for this to happen, as it's 65% in the current version of the bill. And then everybody in the area is subject to it. They would get a payment, a royalty payment for use of their space underneath. And then there are environmental permits for the injection well that require evaluating the geology and keeping the injection well an appropriate distance from structures and other kinds of things, and a fee for every ton of carbon dioxide that's injected. Some of that fee would go to the state to administer the environmental permits. Some would go to the local governments where the injection wells for community benefits. Some would go to emergency responders in that area, emergency planning and responders. And some would go to the state non-game fund. Politics. And then a bunch of it would be saved for the state to use in the future if they need to mitigate problems with such a project. But then the state takes on liability for it after the project is finished and closed and certified by the state as being properly closed. I'm not confident that these projects are going to be permanently trouble-free. So I think the state is taking on a risk, an actual liability. On the other hand, we have a long history of imposing liability on corporations for other forms of pollution. And they have demonstrated very well that they know how to reorganize, sell things, and so on, so as to isolate those liabilities and go bankrupt, dissolve, or otherwise leave it as essentially an orphaned liability, which means the public takes it on. So the state formally taking it on may actually be better than not doing so. But I am not convinced that the fees and the other legal structures are adequate to cover that liability.
Well, I thank you so much, Douglas. I know we're past the hour, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to find any questions. I'm going to save the chat now, and then I'll find any questions that we didn't get a chance to answer and any that were in the registration. And I will ask Douglas to, answer those questions. So thank you so much, everybody, for this great presentation. And Vicky, thank you for your great help on the questions. And thank you all for coming. And especially Douglas, you're such an expert. It's really a pleasure to have you on.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk about it. Obviously, something I care about a lot.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.